Every time we hold space or have a conversation with Yemi, it's just the energy so palpable and constructive and empowering. I don't know, I just always feel so great coming off the back of a conversation in whatever context or environment we meet.
She is, and she really, for me, encapsulates and embodies the theme of this year's Transform Trauma as well, because she is science. She's just, as you say, every time I speak to her, something new. So this whole conversation was, again, something different than we'd ever spoken about. So I just think she's, amazing.
I am Dr. Yemi Joy Penn, and I have to put the joy in it because sometimes my conversations can seem heavy, but I'm a bit of a clown, so I always need to make sure the joy is there, and still getting used to the doctor. But it's important for me, and I guess yeah, we might make sense of that as we go ahead. The best way I can describe myself, especially in the context of speaking to you both and part of masters, is having recently finished my PhD, and it feels like having studied for quite a while over my lifetime of over 4 decades. I appear studious, I appear academic, but the rebellious side of me says, but when can we take the theory off the shelves and start making it practical and available for everybody? And that's where the comes in, is because I don't think I want to be put into any particular box. And so outside of saying I'm a pracademic, I will also say I'm a curious rebel. The fact that I still haven't even answered your question on what I do is because I don't want to be put in a box. But for those who do need identities, I'm an engineer by first profession, but really got interested in how people operate in the different realms that I've worked in as an engineer, an entrepreneur, having had businesses, my own personal lived experience with trauma. But then as I started to manage people, I thought, yeah, I'm an engineer, but I'm actually in the business of people. And for someone who really is very results driven, I found that pretty quickly that in order to get the superior results I'm always aiming for, we're going to need to, as I like to say, clean our trauma. And that was where the interest in making documentaries about transforming trauma and then going on to do a PhD on the transformation of cultural trauma in particular was something that I was just gripped by, which didn't make sense to a lot of people because of all the different identities I have. And so I say all of that to say I am a practitioner who does everything with a rebelliously curious lens.
Amazing, Yemi. I think your kind of life journey has been really fascinating. And I'm actually really, could you talk to me a bit more, talk to us a little bit more about your PhD? Because that was really kind of interesting.
So let me just quickly go back a bit just so you can see the lens. I made my first documentary in 2020, just before Wisdom of Trauma came out. And I didn't know about Gabor Mate then, but it was my story. And it was just the question I asked was, did I choose my trauma? And that already has a spiritual lens, but we'll come back to that. I made the documentary and I found, there's this creative part of me that is just wanting to come out. And I felt this pull to go and do more study. And I thought, no, no, no. I don't want to be that Nigerian that has 5 degrees and isn't doing anything with it. And look, this is a joke that I tell, and I'm happy to own it's something that happens within my culture. It's so many degrees and you don't do anything with it. And I thought the only way I'm going to study again is if I can make a documentary, because I just didn't, something in me just didn't want to do lots of writing. I wanted to communicate in a different way. So I knew that I'm interested in talking about how we transform trauma, because it appears that trauma is out there. If we all stopped, a lot of us would have experienced it. So I was like, now what? What do we do about that? So I knew it was transforming trauma. When I put my proposal into my supervisors at the time, they did say, you're going to need to narrow it down on what type of trauma. And I was guided because I said cultural. I didn't want it to be about the specific trauma I had experienced that still is weaving through how I show up as an adult. I knew I wanted it to be more about society and not just me. And so when I came with cultural trauma, the invitation I was given by my supervisors, well, one of them was, okay, maybe you should look at the cultural trauma of African women in Australia. And something in my body just resisted that. I thought, no, but that feels obvious. That feels obvious. And can we have a different lens? Because I'm sure there are people who are non-African, non-Black, who've experienced trauma. I have friends. And where are their stories being told? And would it change the landscape on the conversation around trauma if we just took, I don't know, this invitation constantly to just focus on one? So my PhD, to bring that all together, is looking at the transformation of cultural trauma through the process of making a documentary, but with a decolonized lens. It's a mouthful, but all of that.
So let's unpick that. What does cultural trauma mean from a decolonized lens, through a decolonized lens?
I'm going to quote Resmaa Menakem first. He wrote this book, My Grandmother's Hands. I've been in some of his workshops. So, and then I will give my definition of what cultural trauma is with my research. So, if trauma decontextualized in a person is personality, trauma decontextualized in family is family traits. This is Resmaa Menakem. And then trauma decontextualized in a people is culture. And I'll go back and I'll say it again. And I know we don't have long. I love that these podcasts are short, and they need to be to allow us to pause and digest. Trauma decontextualized in a person can be seen as personality.
Yeah.
Trauma decontextualized in a family can be seen as family traits. Trauma in a people can be seen as culture. So this is Rakim's words that I had just read because I do my me search, Linda Tai, where I got that wording from. I've always done a lot of me search, but I knew that to sit in this ecosystem that you've created through masters and around the world, I would probably need to bump myself up with more colonial structures of taking a degree, which I have respect for. I don't say that with any shade, but the decolonized lens was part of it. So going back to that definition of culture that Ray gives, I was very interested in the idea that people were conflating culture with race. Well, maybe I was. Maybe my standpoint was conflating. And for me, it was more than that. It was more people. So if you have a people in Australia in a country, if you have a people in a football game, you have people who experienced a tragedy, they start to have a set amount of traits that almost appears cultural. That was the first thing. But for me, culture is defined as an embodiment and a set of ways in which people live out as a response to something that has happened. Now, what may have happened may not always be traumatic because the definition that I shared that Resmaa gave is almost a response to trauma decontextualized. I do think culture can be formed by being proactive. I think it's what's currently bubbling in the world. People are
Is
wanting.
it, yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt, but just when you say the word culture out of the context of your such an overused term in the corporate space, organizations, because it's about their people, they're obsessed with that word culture. How do your culture is not what you say it is, it's what they say it is. And how do you
That
build?
exactly right. So if you've got a really toxic culture in your workspace, that comes from trauma. Everyone is traumatized within that workplace culture, and therefore the way they show up and the traits of that workplace then is the culture of that workplace, and that comes from the trauma that's decontextualized. So then my question is, can you have a culture that has been not formed by trauma? If there is zero trauma, like what happens then?
Totally. And this came about, and it's interesting because it always seems to be a sporting analogy. I can't remember, I spoke to a woman, I can't remember what sport it was, but she said, actually, the culture in our team, maybe, I don't know, maybe it was basketball. The culture in our team is great. We've created a healthy culture and it hasn't come about from trauma. However, something would have happened. This is where I would argue a little bit. Something would have happened in the past where they said, we want to create the opposite of what happened over there. I mean, this goes back to contrast. You know what happiness is because you've experienced sadness. We talk about changing the culture in an organization because in some capacity there has been something toxic. But of course we can. Firstly, how do we contextualize trauma? It's the time. If something happened and we've just ignored it over time, it gets worse, that it almost feels like it's just the traits of these people or the family or personality.
Right? It's like any investment. You put a negative something in investment and it gets worse and worse and worse. If you put something positive, it could get better, better, but it's compounding. Yeah.
Correct. Therefore, with that knowledge, even though you could start a whole new organization or a business or a people, it's to go in and say, well, what are the values? What is the embodiment and the behaviors we want to see exhibited in this place? But there's wisdom. One thing I don't want to do, especially with my decolonized lens, is to ignore what other people have done. There is wisdom in trauma that will allow us to start to create cultures that are healthy and that thrive. So no, culture does not always have to come from having experienced trauma, but there's wisdom in what happened in the past for us to create something new. And that's part of my ongoing work and research. But first it was to say, well, what does that transformation look like? And how has it shown up in the few people that I had as part of my data collection?
And were you looking at, so well, what, when you said you were looking at culture then and transforming trauma, what culture was it? Australian culture? Was it, what culture were you looking at?
Yeah. So these are all self-identified. Now, all the participants who are the key storytellers, there were seven, eight of us in total, all were based in Australia, but their cultural identity was not Australian. So for me, I put myself as, so I was part of it as well, Nigerian. And I'll tell you, someone called me out because I've made mine very, very public in the sense that I updated on my social media. My decolonized lens was to invite community into my process as I was going along. So I'll tell you what I put there. I think I originally named myself as African, and I'll give you the feedback I got from community. A lady put herself as Jewish Australian. That was her cultural identity. Another one was Hungarian and Chinese. One was Iranian, one was Argentinian, and one was German and then Irish. But they all have Australian citizenship, right? So one of the
Including you.
things
Do you have Australian citizenship?
I do have,
You all have,
yeah,
the whole group had Australian
the
citizenship.
whole
Okay.
group had Australian citizenship. But when it came to me putting out the information, because of the sensitivities of trauma, I had people who had expressed an interest in my research, knowing the nature of it. And so they themselves wanted to understand, well, what do you mean by culture? And so I gave these definitions. I think I may have used Alexander's definition, which escapes me now. And that was where they're like, okay, I'm Australian, but when I think of my culture and identity, this is what it is. Now, I
And
think I remember. Go ahead.
I've got a question. So how would you, so you would define yourself? You said you were, first of all, you put African, then you
Yeah.
changed to Nigerian, and you've got a British accent, very British accent, and you live in Australia. So how do
Yeah.
you, because I would have said, if you asked me, I would have said you were, wouldn't necessarily Nigerian unless you told me, but I would have said British, maybe African British, like if you had, but I would have said British because of your accent. It's like I'm
Yeah.
Swedish, but you don't know that I'm Swedish because my accent is British. So it's like, how do you do all this?
It's
And
the complexity, and it goes back to being the curious rebel. I mean, I genuinely say it not just for thing. I do feel like a citizen of the world, and we created these borders, yet we do allow some dual nationality. If anyone asked me, I would still say British Nigerian.
yeah,
That's
no.
how I define myself,
Yeah.
which then makes me feel almost like a traitor to Australia. Um, Especially when I'm here and someone's doing a documentary and the documentary's around African Australians. I don't even know which order, but after 90 minutes, I said I wouldn't identify as African Australians. And they said, but this is what we want to hear and we want to know why.
Isn't it? Because it also I was talking to Bessel about the sense of belonging, and also we were talking to Dr. Martha Newson as well earlier on the podcast about this sense of belonging being so important. So where we say if you say you're British Nigerian in Australia,
Yeah.
then you don't belong in Australia. So then it's like, but if you say, you're in the UK, you could say you're British Nigerian because you belong here. There's a sense of, a community that you have here and also being British. And then, yeah, and then sometimes, I don't know, when I was just thinking, when I used to travel a lot, I would say, if I was in Argentina, I lived in Argentina, I would always say Swedish because they don't like people from the UK. So it's what nationality am I going to pick for where I feel safest? In
Yeah.
Spain, they love Swedish people. So like always be Swedish in Spain. I mean, really, to be honest, everyone preferred Swedish over English. So I would always choose Swedish. You know what I mean? Like it's just like but then I felt like I never belonged anywhere because I never, even in the UK, well, in the UK, I probably would say I was, yeah, British, I would say.
But what does it mean to belong? I mean, firstly, can we just acknowledge that we're all going to have different definitions? What does it mean to belong?
I think
Safety, connecting.
acceptance as well.
Yeah.
Acceptance is the big one, and I think, and safety is again that, but it's accept. So people are just, you're not being an alien, not being someone that's different.
Mhm.
So I
I
think,
feel
See,
like I
I
belong
feel
more. So you go, go, go.
I can feel belonging whilst being in an environment where it's very different. Do you know what I mean? Like, as in, like, there's a huge. So if I belonging doesn't, for me, feel geographical, it feels more outlook based. So now I was just thinking, like, if I travel with work, I take a
Mm.
yoga mat and I can go to a yoga, I can do something that feels quite I can walk into a random place and feel like I belong just by virtue of these people are on a mat practicing yoga with me. It's a very
Yeah.
odd, which if I went into a bar, I would not have that feeling in any way, shape, or form. So for me, it's slightly different to there is some sort of connection or community or something that feels like home.
Shared thing, maybe.
Yeah,
A
yeah.
shared
Shared.
Yeah.
set something, a shared set of something that you share with someone else. Now, whether that's, you know, identity, whether that's kind of your geographical, you both all both. I mean, the thing is, what's so ridiculous is there's two people who were born in Britain I couldn't be more polar opposite than someone who strings up a flag, down the road. That couldn't be
Mm,
more. But they're both of us were born in the UK. So why then I don't feel like if I was around those kind of people, I wouldn't feel like I belonged at all. So
mm.
I think it is a shared set of values, and you can get that in a yoga studio. You can get that where your people are, and your people are defined by shared
Ooh,
values.
just reflecting on that, all this polarization does
Mm.
create a sense of you not belonging in your own. Like I have felt at times recently, like I don't belong in certain places or spaces which otherwise would have been felt like home,
Yeah.
because I've just can't align to it. So I,
It's not the place you've always known. It's almost it's changed. But I think which is why culturally and the word is so loaded. I think we're going to need to redefine things. I really do think we're in an era of redefining certain things.
Yeah.
One thing that came up in my research was that there are a set of beliefs, universal beliefs, and one of them is that if I'm a good person, good things will happen to me. And it's probably worded slightly different, but there's this inner feeling, which is the reason why we can't understand why things happen to people. Why by or if it's us, but it's really ingrained in us. But I did everything right.
On that question, so I'm a good person, so good things. So we've got you're saying in your research that comes up. Do you think someone who has lived through a lifetime of conflict or born in a conflict zone and lived always where every single, never, ever in their life has anything good happened to them? Not once. Like, they were born into a war zone and the war's been continued for until they're 20 years old and they've never left it. Do
Mm.
you think they have an intrinsic, and this is just a question, do you think they have an intrinsic belief that if I'm a good person, good things will happen to me? Or do you think they have to say, I am a good person, but bad things are gonna, because they must know that they're good people.
I think it's possible for them to still hold that. But remember, another thing that comes on is meaning making, is how much we try to make things make sense. So what you just described could be your view. One of the guys who's in my research in the documentary has been one of my previous ones. He was in Iran. He remembers being underneath the car when he's hearing the bomb, but he's still telling stories of things that were going really well while they were
Yeah.
hiding.
Like you said, yeah. They
So
have to see positivity, I guess. I don't know. Again, I haven't experienced it, so I don't, it's hard.
it is, but I think it's our understanding. And if I give another example, like, because for us, that you like, how can you find something that things always go? How
Yeah.
can you, if your country has been under oppression for 20 years? That's what we think on the outside, but it's something completely different. The same with when I go back to Nigeria and I see all these things in the media, but what I'm experiencing on the ground every now and again, a moment's joy. But give it a 24 hours and someone will be messaging me, please, can you send money? Things are really difficult. So I think, firstly, people do think if I do good things will happen. They can still think that even when things aren't going to plan. Gosh, and Peppers has just taken my other thought. My goodness.
tell me about it.
It just snatched it out. All right, I'll let you know if it comes.
So when you were doing this documentary, I mean this PhD, were you filming? So when you made it into a documentary, is that with all the interviews and everything that you were doing?
Yeah, so that was my data collection. My data, and and part of my decolonizing lens is to try to change the language, but this is my own stuff. So part of my data collection was to capture it on film. So I would ask questions and I would find themes. And I remember actually I presented my research at the Trauma Research Foundation conference in Boston, not last year, the year before. And I had a conversation with Bessel and love him and his work. And he was questioning how not legitimate but how weighted this research can be because of the small sample size and the fact that it wasn't a controlled one. Like I'm basically living off of people's lived experience through the stories they're telling, and I'm capturing it in this creative art form. So the filming wasn't that I went around, it was a controlled space. There were questions I asked, but really made it very flexible, so semi-structured. But one thing that made my research slightly different is that after I made the documentary, I want to know what the role is of an audience who listens to people's stories. So my documentary is two parts. It's people sharing their stories one on one. What happens in that stories when we listen and bear witness to each other in a circle? But then what is the meaning we make of that when an audience is watching? And having worked with my supervisors and those who have seen it as well, they actually find the audience's response not more powerful, but as powerful. It's something that must be acknowledged. I have my view on filmmaking and the role and the influence and the power I hold as a director and how much I get to influence what you see. But that was it was purely for data collection, but also a means that I wanted to be a practice to make sure that this could be a tool for conversation for people who are not practitioners.
It does make the outcome of the research more accessible because of that.
Yeah, if you think about how many research papers have you read, unless it's part of what we do, like I don't read research for anything other than very specific to the trauma or what we're, a speaker I'm thinking about, you like hiring or whatever. You don't read random research papers, but you might watch documentary, you know.
Exactly.
Yeah,
And I think that's the for me is really interesting because we talk about how do we democratize more of what's known, more of that
yeah,
knowledge that comes, and people like Gabor speak from lived experience, from a practical experience perspective.
yeah.
They use different books and so this for me is interesting. How did you? I'm really curious as to how you where that conversation went in terms of the questions around sample size and how did that?
I said, well, that's why I'm using the decolonized lens, Bessel. And then I mentioned, oh, there's a lady, it's the art, Claire Macchiodi. Maybe I haven't said
Oh
her
yeah,
well.
Kathy Malchiodi.
Yeah, yeah, Kathy. But then he suggested I speak to, I think it was Wendy, if I get
Yeah,
her. He
great.
suggested I speak to Wendy because I came back to him and I said, look, this is part of the decolonized lens, is there's a lot of gatekeeping around research and data, and it's valid. I'm an engineer. I have much respect for science, and which is why the theme you have this year for the masters, because you're now bringing in spirituality. I mean, how rebellious could you be? I mean, it's just so delicious. I'm excited. And it's not to cancel each other out. And I think they've always been at each other's necks. But that's what I put to Bessel and said that there has to be a way for us to another way for us to collect data. I said, I agree, but this idea of controlling humans and environments as the only way to produce data, I think we've got to challenge it. And that's part of the decolonized lens.
And it's fascinating, actually, as you took it, you just made me realize it landed of what you were talking about with your supervisors is that, yes, you have a selection sample at first of 8 people that you filmed the documentary of, but onwards, if this is a continuous research project, you then have the data collection of every single audience member that watches and experiences
Bingo,
that. So
bingo.
potentially you have a huge, as long as someone is, with the groups that are watching it and collecting their feelings or sentiments after watching it, I think, yeah, you've got an ongoing research project
Yeah,
there.
and that's what happens. Well, for some people, grounded theory, and I know researchers have different views on what they think is the most valuable form, but I think they all are valid. And Bessel very much, he definitely did respect it, which I loved. And even hearing him share that he's learned differently over time, especially when it came to the subjects of psychedelics and stuff. It took him a while before that eventually came on. And that's something I'm always grateful for the teachers who have come before us who are still open to the idea of different, yeah, different opinions and different ways of.
Evolution of how to do anything, right? Because but then I think the problem is academia and education specifically are the things that have been so stuck in the past that haven't
Yeah.
evolved. Like, I mean, we haven't evolved the way we teach our kids since Victorian ages, you know what I mean? We're like all still standing, sitting in rows in classrooms, same as when we do the events that we run, we have accreditation systems that most of them are still stuck in the times when they believe that you have to sit in a windowless lecture hall being
Yeah.
didactically dictated at by a teacher, and that's the only way you can learn anything. And it's like that's not true. That's not true. And I think
Yeah.
research is the same. It's like outdated. But it's people like you, who are going to change that paradigm and going to make a difference, and maybe people like us too, and how we
You already are. You already are.
yeah, deliver content. So, well, Yemi, this has been absolutely so fascinating and interesting, and I really can't wait for you to come to Oxford this year and present. It's going to be really, really great to have you on stage.
I'm very excited. I'm very excited. But yeah, also just for the, I want to use the word diverse, but it's not the way people think. Just the difference that you offer. So I'm very excited, and I'll be sharing some of the PhD document and the findings that come out.
It's going to be great.
Wonderful. We'll see you on the dance floor too.
Yeah, I've already got my outfit, believe it or not.
Have you? Oh, you
Don't
see.
say that. I haven't. I'm going to beat the one I wore last year now. So
Yeah, I
I'm
know.
it's like,
Yeah, well, I saw that, and I thought to myself, my son would say you're lagging, so I need to up my game. But yeah, no, looking forward to it.
Amazing.
amazing.
Great. Thanks, yeah, Mick.
Thanks so
All right,
much.
take care, ladies.